This revised Unit 10, we'll be discussing metaethics, relativism, and Ross's prima facie duties, and considering whether or not moral norms exist or not. In this unit, we're going to be taking a brief look at metaphysics, metaethics, and we'll do that by first looking at the three major divisions in ethics. We've looked at that once before, and we'll come back and refresh that. And the reason we're going to be looking at metaethics is that a question is going to come up in the last three ethical theories we'll look at in relation to, is there such a thing as real and objective moral truth? That's a metaethical question. And when we've talked about that in general, then we'll look at the three primary theories for consideration in this unit: skepticism, ethical relativism, and moral nihilism. We'll draw some implications out of that process of reflecting. We'll step aside and talk about moral progress and what that means in relation to moral absolutism. And then we'll come around and make some suggestions for considering the place of fundamental moral values. So that's where we're going, and so to that end, we'll come to begin the process of approaching metaethics. It will help us, I think, if we begin by reflecting back on all the ethical theories we've considered. And all of them we've considered in the context of what is a good life, and seen how the good life impacts upon the development of that ethical theory, in fact gives it direction. We focused on hedonism and Epicurus. Hedonism on one hand, and Epicurus with a more subtle and defined view of hedonism, avoidance of pain. And we moved to Plato and Aristotle and others. And as we've done that, just as the textbook you've been looking at does, we've tried to consider some of the strengths and some of the challenges to each of the theories. And we're going to realise that no one theory seems, in terms of the present state of academic study of ethics, to have won the day. All the theories have given us some sort of moral guidance, or at least attempt to give us moral guidance. But the moral guidance is quite different when we look at the theories. But a common theme you should have observed coming up both in the videos and in the textbook and your other readings is that as we look at a theory and evaluate its effectiveness, we keep coming up against a sort of informal test of commonly held fundamental moral values or norms that are there in the background. For example, if a theory produced the idea, any ethical theory produced the idea that slavery was a good thing, we would go, hang on, there's something wrong with that theory. Because there are some core values that seem to be commonly accepted, even though we may not be able to put our finger quite on them. We've also seen that while all the ethical theories began with a discussion of what is the good life, there was very little agreement. Take Epicurus on one hand and contrast that with happiness according to Thomas Aquinas and the virtue ethics. Two quite different conceptions of the good life. You see that the ethical theories all seem to establish one or maybe several fundamental concepts or principles out of which they have a view of the good life. Out of it they develop one or a number of principles from which they then develop the ethical theory. So in other words, those are foundational. So in other words, there's a values to some concepts and then the theory step. Of course, you may have reached the conclusion, having gone this far in the course, why bother with ethics? Goodness, they can't agree on anything, and surely we should know something. Well, I would suggest to you that notwithstanding all the observations we've just made, there's some very good things come out of the study of ethics. I just mention a couple of them at this point in time. There's a tacit recognition that human beings seem to acknowledge some commonly held fundamental values. Secondly, there's a desire for moral evaluation, moral judgments, and the fact that our conduct needs to be accountable, and we need to be accountable to ourselves. However, setting those benefits aside, in our first two videos in particular, lectures, we particularly focused on the value of studying ethics, so I'm not going to go back to that. But the observations we've made also lead us to the question, is there such a thing as morality? And of course, that will take us into this discussion of metaethics. This is just a summation of the issues where we're going. Here is the academic study again of ethics. We have descriptive ethics and we have nominative ethics, these two main active branches of ethics. And in this course, that's where we primarily focus. And you can see the subject, we've looked at this slide before, you can see where we've been going. But we're coming to the third area, this area here. And we're going to do that in relation to an important subtopic. So let's go there now. You've seen that slide before. I'm not going to spend any time on this one. What is metaethics? Well, I've given you this definition a couple of times now. Metaethics is a process in which we discuss the meaning of moral terms, the ways of discussing the concept of morality itself, and the status of morality. What's the situation? There are a number of important questions considered in metaethics. The one we're focusing on today is going to be on the status of morality. And perhaps rather than give a fancy definition to the status of morality, let me suggest that there are three approaches to the status of morality. What's the status of morality itself? Well, one view, the approach number one on the screen, is that moral truths are objective. They have an independent existence and they apply to everyone everywhere. And there's reasons for that. Kant is an example of such an approach. Moral norms and standards, rules apply to everyone everywhere independently whether you agree or disagree. So the metaethics is the reasoning to justify that. You will see that in establishing Kant's view of morality, he's had to discuss some elements of metaphysics. Approach number two, it gives reasons for moral truths being relativistic. They're dependent upon the particular person or the culture and the cultural preferences and traditions. So they're individual preferences or they're subcultures and culture traditions and values. And the third approach, there's reasoning that comes up with the notion that moral truths are a kind of morality game. That may not be a good description of them, but it's the best one I can come up with. Moral truths are a fiction, they're not real, and yet we get engaged in them. This view does not have a very high view of the value of morality. And that brings us to the three views we want to look at and reflect on today. First, let's begin with moral skepticism in general. Moral skepticism is a way of describing a number of views that deny or raise doubts about the role of reason in morality. Can reason work in morality? The skeptic says, morality is not something that could be subject to reasoning. And there are two key kinds of ethical skepticism that we want to look at today. Ethical relativism and moral nihilism. Now, let's be clear about what we're talking about here. These two theories are not arguing that moral knowledge is impossible or the idea of knowing something's right and wrong is out of the question. But rather, these two theories are arguing that, or perhaps I should say questioning, the possibility of there being objective moral standards, objective morals that apply across the board in any way. So with that in mind, let's look at ethical relativism. Now, at the heart of ethical relativism is the view that there's no one absolute system of truth in ethics. That what is morally right varies from person to person and from society to society, from culture to culture. But to this point, we need to very significantly distinguish between personal ethics and, if you like, social or community ethics, communal ethics. Cultural relativism is a discussion of ethical values for the culture and the community and the various communities. Individual relativism, often referred to as ethical subjectivism, basically is very straightforward. Moral standards are those endorsed by you and by you and by you, and there's no necessary relationship between any of them. Now, the textbook has a brief discussion of the pros and cons of this. I think that you can see that at one level, it's a very attractive theory. Surely you have the right to have your views. I have the right to have mine. And that's good as far as it goes. But as soon as we move from the individual and move into the community, whatever community you move into, those claims that you have find themselves being confronted by other people's claims of what they think. In other words, the problem with ethical subjectivism is that it really can't work in society and can't really give a guidance to the community as a whole. And so, while we're not sweeping it aside, we're acknowledging its reality, its significance to the individual, we need to move on to cultural relevance. Cultural relativism. Now, cultural relativism says moral standards are built upon the moral values of a particular culture or society. Now, that's very straightforward. But it carries with it an important recognition. It's called moral equivalence. Because in this theory, everyone's basic values are viewed as valid. If you base your moral standards on your cultural values, by definition, if they're based on that, they're valid. They're true, if you like. And as a result, if we have 2, 3, 4 different cultures, then the moral values they base on their cultures are valid also. And they're equally valid. They're morally equivalent. Moral equivalence. Now, this is moral equivalence is a very useful idea because it's wrapped up in cultural relativism. It's useful in the sense that many see it as a significant and important factor in advancing and promoting multiculturalism and diversity in societies, where we have respect for minorities and minority cultures. Their moral views, their moral values are as good as our moral values, the way they see things. And this, of course, requires moral equivalence, requires the acknowledgement that their values are equally as valid and right as anybody else's. But this does raise a number of difficulties, and these might be described as the very last point, the problems of moral equivalence. Sometimes those moral values of this culture and the moral values of this culture will clash. For example, what we would view as being the reasonable treatment of all people as being a moral necessity, respect of persons, was fundamentally in conflict during the Second World War with the Nazis' value of Jewish people and certain other minorities as being less than human. And it was morally right, in that view, to treat those people like you treat an animal. Hence, there was a moral justification for the conduct being carried out. There's clearly a conflict of values. All right, there's conflicting moral values. There are some of the challenges to the broad application of moral equivalence. That's wrong moral values and the extreme application of moral values is the second. Examples of wrong moral values are values which the community sees as essentially right and another community sees as essentially right. These two being incompatible, one has got to be right and one has got to be wrong. And every illustration here overlaps with the previous or comes out of conflicting moral values. Wrong moral values, for example, would be slavery being an example. Slavery is fundamentally wrong. It's morally wrong. And a society that promoted that and said it was okay, indeed furthered it in some way, is clearly promoting a wrong moral value, a culture. And it's always possible for people to take a particular moral value and take it to the extreme. Be so right that they're wrong. Well, we can come with all kinds of problems with moral equivalence, and yet it's a powerful presupposition in the mind of our present culture and a desire to not put ourselves in the box of absolute moral principles or absolutism. However, it needs to be taken into account. Well, if cultural relativism is popular today, is there some way in which one can take this theory and give it a boost so it avoids things like the conflicting moral values and wrong values and extremes and the inherent problems? Well, the suggestion has been made that cultural relativism can be helped by creating an abstraction called the ideal observer. This is a procedural concept. This concept is formed by conceiving core moral values and standards that are chosen because those core moral values and standards will be what society would approve if it were composed of perfectly rational and fully informed individuals. The idea being that you essentially come up with core values that all cultures and subcultures need to live with, at least fundamentally, because they are the ones which we might say are ideal. Now, the problem with this concept is that it's inherently an elitist conception. You've seen a number of our ethical theories, various ways of describing these elitist ethical thinkers who come up with the core values and describe them, define them for us. Now, elitism is, in one sense, a very good thing. If I am sick, or have cancer, or have need of a surgeon, I really want to go to an elitist doctor or surgeon. That's a good thing. And if someone is making a decision for me, I want that person to be competent, skilled, to be rational, informed. That seems to be a very good thing. And indeed, the whole concept of electing representatives to go to our Congress and speak for us, they're not our agents, they're not there to do our bidding, but they're there, we're expecting them to act as perfectly rational and fully informed individuals. But I do chuckle because, as wonderful a concept as it is, it's also a frightening one as well. Because, first and foremost, who's going to decide who the elitists are? Who are the elitists we're going to use? Now, realise that the elite observer, the ideal observer, is an abstraction. It's not a particular person or a group of persons. But nonetheless, the ideal observer will come about because of the views of various elite observers. And so, that's wonderful, but it also has a weakness. There always seems to be different conceptions among the various ideal observers. And worse still, what if an ideal observer or observers went against our commonly accepted views of morality? For example, determining it's perfectly okay to kill all diminished persons. And that's not out of the realm of possibility. Diminished persons are a great burden on society, burden on their families, and their quality of life is clearly diminished. Well, I'm not going to go into that here because it's a medical ethics discussion, but obviously you can tell that I don't think that's a very good idea. It's a form of eugenics which I think we must reject. The elitist conception of the ideal observer has all the wonderful traits of the ideal concepts within our Constitution. Just think about it for a moment. It's a wonderful thing to think that anyone, any natural-born American, can grow up and become President of the United States. On the other hand, that's terrifying. Anyone could do that? I've become a bit of an elitist at this point. Well, I'll leave you to think that one through for yourselves. It's off track, so let's get back on track. Let's now turn to moral nihilism. It's it's a metaphysical view that nothing is morally right or wrong. And if nothing's right or wrong because there's no standard by which it can be decided to be right or wrong. Nihilism meaning nil. There are two forms, as I think, the error theory and expressivism. But before we go look at those, let's just remind ourselves that there is a key conception behind moral nihilism. It's a rigid assertion of the fact-value distinction, in which it is asserted that values are not facts, and you must not confuse values for facts, because facts don't exist. With that in mind, let's briefly look at error theory. Physical world error theory asserts does not have moral features or characteristics. In other words, trees, shrubs, animals, there's no moral characteristics to them. This is like a rejection of the natural law theory. Secondly, hence, moral judgments can't be true, because moral judgments can only be made about facts. And hence, it's an error to try to make such judgments. It's making an error with the fact-value distinction. And hence, morality is a figment of our human imagination. Expressivism, on the other hand, while agreeing with error theory that the physical world does not have moral features and characteristics, and hence judgments can't be true in and of themselves. Expressivism, on the other hand, asserts that moral judgments are our attempt to describe the moral features and characteristics of actions and things. In other words, we're describing or attributing to actions and things a moral perspective. And again, expressivism provides little or no guidance for making moral judgments, just simply sitting there like an independent observer. And so we can draw out some implications from skepticism, moral nihilism, etc. Moral judgments, at best, are not authoritative and probably don't exist at all. One can't meaningfully provide moral justification for one's actions. I had a right to do this, and this is my reasoning. You can't do that. And moral standards are not real. Now, with that in mind, let's go on and notice that there is a discussion, both in textbook and other places, about moral progress of society. That our society has become morally superior than it was 100 years ago. And indeed, any serious reflection of the state of affairs today over against 100 years ago, especially in the USA and Western Europe, there certainly does appear to be something like moral progress. For example, our culture has clearly moved away from the view that slavery was morally acceptable to the view that it was unacceptable. And you could list many others. This could be viewed as moral progress. Now, for cultural relativism, it can't explain moral progress. Remember, nihilism rejects it. Cultural relativism has to back away from explaining moral progress because the fundamental assumption in cultural relativism is that the basic cultural values of a society are true and valid. If you're reflecting the views of your culture, then you're reflecting a right value on culture. And what's more, they just can't change. At least the assumptions, they don't change. I think that may not be a valid assumption, but nonetheless, on the basis of its fundamental view, cultural relativism can't really address moral progress. Secondly, moral progress is a very useful tool, contemporary ethics would tell us. It's a very useful tool because it provides a way of validating the ongoing development of ethical theories and ethical views. Providing you don't hold an absolutist position. If you hold an absolute position, then there's a different situation altogether. In other words, if your moral theory precludes the possibility of moral progress, it would be argued your moral theory is deficient. However, I'd suggest to you that this is not quite as simple as it sounds, because a society's moral progress might be a process of human moral development, which would be what the current perspective on moral progress is. On the other hand, it may be something quite different. Pause, and if you have studied history, you might find it interesting to have noted some of the arguments used by abolitionists, both in the United Kingdom and here in America, in the fight against slavery. And in some respects, what they did is a reflection of the second bullet under the word however. Is this movement or change in perspective one that comes about by reflecting on our common core values, which have not changed, and then our culture and society has made a correction away from a social moral failure to a position of moral rectitude? I'm more inclined to think the second. As I read the historical arguments for abolition, for example, they're all based on traditional cultural moral values, what we might call core moral values. It may be necessary to rethink the meaning of cultural relativism, of moral progress, and how we view it. However, let's move on to say, is there some way we can posit the reality of fundamental human values, some way in which we can say that fundamental human values are really a part of the woof and womb of life. In this regard, let's first distinguish moral values and norms from objective standards. Objective standards are more like rules, whereas fundamental moral norms are more like principles. One philosopher, W.D. Ross, who published a work in 1930 called The Right and the Good, argued for a thing called prima facie duties. Prima facie duties. Now, he wasn't promoting ethical rules. In fact, he said, I don't want you to think of prima facie duties as duties, but rather as statements which set out permanent moral reasons. They're propositions rather than simple one-word principles. And secondly, to realise that they partly define whether an action is truly moral or whether an action is truly required. He asserted there were many prima facie duties, but he said that each one was fundamental, irreducible. It was a foundational principle expressed in a set of permanent moral reasons. And each one of those prima facie duties can be outweighed by competing reasons. In other words, they didn't know one particular prima facie duty didn't always win the day. And in that regard, it's worth to know that the real question is, how do we know what are the fundamental moral values and rules? How do we know what are the prima facie duties? Ross's answer was that these prima facie duties are self-evident. And of course, one might say this is the rub with his view. You see, a claim is self-evident because they accord with our deepest beliefs and are accepted just in case they're true. We hang on to them just in case they're true. And we understand them. And that's enough to make them justified in our minds, and us justified as believing them. Ross listed 7. He insisted they were not exhaustive. For example, reparations, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, fidelity, non-malfeasance. Some of the bottom one may have gone off the screen for you. However, it's interesting that list is. I don't want to go into too much more detail, other than to say that this view of Ross has some things to recommend it to us. It affirms objective moral standards. It does permit multiple moral standards. It's a pluralistic system. It accommodates the sense that there is more than one single fundamental ethical consideration. In other words, ethical decisions are complex. In addition, no one of these prima facie duties was absolute over against any other prima facie duty. In other words, he basically was setting forth a paradigm for considering an issue, considering a decision or a situation from a multifaceted perspective. And that sometimes he felt this system would enable one to explain why it's permissible to break the rules, because they're non-absolute. It also helps understand moral conflict. You might be emphasizing one principle more than another. He gives reasons why regret is sometimes appropriate, even when it's done nothing wrong. One can see, and we've done the right thing, but see that it's a grievous situation. But as helpful as his system is, it still has to deal with the issue of self-evidence, that the view is self-evident. Well, with all of this in mind, can we put together some suggestions for positing the reality of self-evident fundamental values. This is different from saying self-evident prima facie duties. It's saying there are moral values that exist. Throughout the course, you've seen them coming up time and time again, both in textbooks and in these lectures. Somehow we know they're there. And is this idea of self-evidence something worth following through on? So let's look at a few little points here. Self-evident moral values, or even one of Ross's duties, are not in themselves irrational. They're not irrational. Is self-evidence a sign of irrationality? And I would say no. It's self-evident that I exist, whatever I'm a thinking being. Descartes, a famous philosopher, who promoted that idea. Cogito ergo sum. It's frustrated philosophers ever since. But nonetheless, existence as a predicate is a powerful, self-evident truth which helps us in many situations. Self-evident claims can in fact be based on logic, science, mathematics. And when they are, they're irrefutable. Logic. All bachelors are unmarried, by definition. The sum of two odd numbers is even. Now, outside of logic, math and science, there seems to be common knowledge. Well, that common knowledge of an issue or a principle or an idea may not have complete specific content. In other words, they're principial in nature. They're very powerful and exist. For example, the concept of justice. Every human being cries out for justice. Beneficence. We understand beneficence. Ross is right in accepting that as a very foundational. We love grace and beneficence and kindness. It's highly valued. And it is valued. It's a value. And we value acceptance. It's a very important value. And self-evident moral claims seem to be consistent with human character. People are crying out for what is morally right, what is morally just, fairness. Even young children very quickly take up the cry for fairness. You've probably heard them. That's not fair. And yet they seem to know exactly what that means. And self-evident moral claims are consistent with the view that humans are moral beings, with a sense that some things are morally right and other things are morally wrong. And lastly, self-evident moral claims form the basis of international law, which is profoundly important. All the operations of the post-war war trials, crimes, and today the operation of the International Court of Criminal Justice, these courts operate on the basis that there's somehow, we all know there are some fundamental moral rights and wrongs. I think it's sufficient for us to at least come to the conclusion that it is more than justifiable to say that there are moral values and they're fundamental. Well, what do you have to know in this course to finish it, in this unit to finish well and get ready for examinations? Well, here's the list of them for you. Know the major divisions, the study of ethics, know what metaphysics is, be able to have some discussion and appreciation of is there such thing as a real objective moral truth, understand what skepticism, ethical relativism and moral nihilism are and their divisions, understand some of the implications which come from those three theories, have an understanding about moral progress and it's a direct challenge to moral absolutism, and just take into account that you know some of the suggestions for the reality of fundamental moral values. Well, thank you for watching.